The most dangerous thing Iran did was not making a claim. The most dangerous thing Iran did was forcing America to answer in a language most people do not understand. That language was not English. It was not diplomacy. It was not a Pentagon press statement. It was an aircraft, the E-6B Mercury. When Iran claimed that more than 200 American soldiers had been killed in one day, the headline immediately became the number 220. A number large enough to shock the public, large enough to rattle markets, large enough to make every military family ask whether the government is telling the full truth. But the real story is not the number alone. The real story is that America's answer was not simple denial. America's answer was strategic signaling. And when a country responds to a casualty claim with an aircraft built to preserve nuclear command and control, you are no longer watching ordinary crisis management. You are watching deterrence under stress. That is what this moment is really about. Iran may have exaggerated. Iran may have inflated the count for propaganda. Iran may have taken a real attack, wrapped it in a larger number, and pushed it into the global information system. That would not be surprising. Governments do that in war. But America's response tells us something important. Washington did not treat the moment as nothing. If it had been nothing, there would have been a blunt denial, a clean statement, a simple dismissal. The Pentagon would have said the claim is false and moved on. Instead, the language was careful, the posture shifted, the signals became visible, and the E-6B entered the picture. That means the crisis had crossed a threshold, not necessarily a nuclear threshold, not necessarily a point of no return, but a threshold where the United States felt the need to remind the world that escalation has a ceiling, and that ceiling is backed by the most powerful military system ever built. That sounds like strength, but strength has a strange problem in moments like this. The more loudly a great power has to prove is in control, the more the world suspects control is under pressure. This is the paradox of deterrence. If you do not signal, your opponent may think you are weak. If you signal too visibly, your opponent may think you are afraid. If you respond militarily, you risk escalation. If you respond only with words, you risk looking exposed. If you hide information, you create suspicion. If you release information too early, you reveal too much. There is no clean move. That is why this crisis matters. Iran has forced the United States into a game where every response carries a cost. Let me put the whole thing in order. First, Iran makes a shocking casualty claim. Second, the number spreads before Washington can control it. Third, the Pentagon avoids giving the kind of clear counter number that would kill the story immediately. Fourth, America moves a strategic command asset, the kind of platform meant for the most severe national security conditions. Fifth, everyone watching draws the same conclusion: something serious happened, or Washington wants everyone to believe it is ready for something serious. Either way, the crisis grows. That is the escalation mirror. An escalation mirror is when one side makes a move that forces the other side to respond. But the response itself reflects the seriousness of the original move back to the world. Iran says it has inflicted historic losses. America says little but moves a nuclear command aircraft. The aircraft is meant to deter Iran, but it also tells everyone else that the claim could not simply be ignored. That is exactly the kind of mirror a weaker power wants to create, because Iran does not need to defeat America in a conventional war. It knows it cannot. It needs to make America pay attention. It needs to force America to move. It needs to expose the fact that the United States, despite its carriers and bases and satellites and missiles, can still be dragged into a crisis on terms it did not choose. That is the deeper humiliation, not losing a battle, losing control of the rhythm for decades. American strategy in the Middle East relied on rhythm control. Washington decided when to surge forces. Washington decided when to punish. Washington decided when to announce a red line. Washington decided when to ignore provocations. Smaller states and militias reacted to the American clock. Iran has spent years trying to break that clock. It has built a network designed to create simultaneous pressure. Militias in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, missile units inside Iran, drones, fast boats, cyber capacity, political relationships with Russia and China, and above all, the ability to make every local strike feel like part of a larger regional pattern. That is why a single casualty claim cannot be separated from the system around it. If Iran really killed American troops, then this is a military crisis. If Iran exaggerated, it is still an information crisis. If America cannot explain the difference quickly, it becomes a political crisis. If America responds visibly, it becomes an escalation crisis. If energy markets react, it becomes an economic crisis. That is how Iran wants the battlefield to work. One spark, five fires. That is the doctrine. Now, why would Iran do this? The simple answer is propaganda, but simple answers are usually too small. Yes, Iran wants to look strong at home. It wants to show its population that the American military can bleed. It wants to tell the region that resistance works. It wants to prove that its forces and aligned groups can hit back. But the deeper motive is leverage. A country under pressure needs bargaining chips. Iran knows that if it enters any negotiation looking weak, it will be asked to surrender more. It knows that if Washington believes air power and sanctions are working, America will keep pressing. So Iran needs moments that disrupt the assumption of American dominance. A shocking casualty claim does that. It tells Washington this war will not be cost free. It tells Gulf states your bases and waters are not insulated from escalation. It tells Israel American power is not a magic shield. It tells Russia and China Iran is still useful as an anti-American pressure point. It tells its own public the system can still strike back. That is a lot of messaging packed into one number, 220. Again, the exact truth of the number still matters. But strategically, the number has already done something. It has forced the world to look. It has forced the United States to respond. It has pushed the crisis from the background noise of Middle East conflict into the foreground of global risk. And once a story moves into global risk, the battlefield expands. Oil traders start watching Hormuz, insurance companies start repricing shipping, allies start asking for briefings, military families start looking for confirmation, political opponents start demanding accountability, foreign intelligence services start leaking and counter-leaking. Social media fills the gaps faster than official institutions can verify them. This is not a side effect. This is part of the weapon. The modern battlefield includes the time between the claim and the confirmation. That window is where panic grows. That window is where narratives harden. That window is where governments lose trust if they look evasive. Iran knows this. Russia knows this. China knows this. Every state that studies America understands this. America is strongest when the issue is firepower. America is weaker when the issue is narrative trust. That is why this moment is so uncomfortable for Washington. The United States can strike targets. It can move fleets. It can deploy aircraft. It can destroy infrastructure, but it cannot easily force people to believe a statement if the first statement is too vague, too delayed, or too obviously shaped by political caution. Credibility is slower than propaganda. Propaganda only needs to be first. Credibility has to be precise. That is an enormous disadvantage in a crisis, and that is why Iran used a large specific number. It did not need to be fully verified in the first hour. It needed to be unforgettable. Once people hear 220, they do not forget it. They compare every later statement to it. If Washington says nothing, the number grows in the imagination. If Washington says fewer, people ask how many fewer. If Washington says classified suspicion deepens, the number becomes a trapdoor. Now let us talk about the E-6B again, because this is the image that should stay in your mind. A flying nuclear command post does not appear in the story by accident. It is part of America's continuity system. The machinery that ensures the United States can still command its most destructive weapons, even if command centers on the ground are destroyed. It represents the deepest layer of American strategic power. So what does it mean when that layer becomes visible in a regional crisis? It means Washington wants the crisis contained by reminding everyone of the ultimate ceiling. It is saying, do not mistake restraint for inability. Do not assume local casualties mean strategic weakness. Do not push this into a place where the response becomes uncontrollable. But it also means America is no longer comfortable letting the situation remain at the militia and base level. That is the important part. The signal itself is evidence of stress. Iran knows that. The world knows that. Markets know that. And once strategic assets are used as signals, the next question becomes very dangerous. What signal comes next if the first one does not work? That is the escalation ladder nobody wants to climb. Maybe the next signal is more naval movement. Maybe it is a strike on IRGC infrastructure. Maybe it is cyber retaliation. Maybe it is a public warning to Tehran. Maybe it is direct pressure on Iraqi and Syrian militia networks. Maybe it is an attempt to restore deterrence through a spectacular strike. Every option carries risk. A small response may look weak. A large response may widen the war. A covert response may not restore public confidence. A public response may force Iran to answer. A diplomatic response may be attacked at home as surrender. A military response may create the very war Washington says it does not want. That is why the United States is in a harder position than it appears. It has unmatched power. But unmatched power does not automatically create good choices. This is one of the great misunderstandings of American foreign policy. People assume that because America can destroy more, it can always control more. That is not true. Destruction is not the same as control. Sometimes the more destruction you threaten, the more your opponent spreads the conflict into places where your destruction creates new problems. Iran has spent decades preparing for that. It does not have to protect every asset. It has to make every American action create a secondary cost, strike Iran, and oil markets move, strike militias, and bases become targets. Threaten leadership, and proxies activate, push too hard in the Gulf, and Hormuz becomes uncertain, escalate visibly, and Russia and China gain a new opportunity to accuse America of destabilizing the world. This is not because Iran is stronger than America. It is because Iran is positioned in a place where escalation spreads. Geography is power. Hormuz is power. Proxies are power. Narrative confusion is power. Willingness to absorb pain is power. That combination makes Iran dangerous. Now, the worst mistake Washington could make is to treat this only as a question of punishment. Punishment may be necessary from a deterrence perspective, but punishment without a strategy can become a ritual. Strike, claim success, absorb retaliation, strike again, claim success again, then wonder why the war is bigger and the political problem remains unsolved. That is how great powers get trapped. They begin by saying they are restoring deterrence. They continue because the previous act of restoration did not work. They escalate because stopping would look like weakness. Eventually, the war is no longer about the original attack. It is about the credibility of every prior decision. Iran wants that. Iran wants America to make the war about American prestige because once prestige is on the line, leaders become less flexible. They make choices to avoid looking defeated, not choices that solve the problem. That is the trap. And the 220 claim is useful because it attacks prestige directly. It says American soldiers died in large numbers. It says Washington could not prevent it. It says the Pentagon may not be telling the full story. It says the strongest military in the world is vulnerable in the region it claims to dominate. A claim like that demands an answer, but the answer can become the next trap. This is why the right question is not only, did it happen? The right question is, what does America now feel compelled to do? Because Iran said it happened. That is where wars are born. Not only from facts, but from the decisions leaders make while trying to respond to facts, rumors, claims, humiliations, fears, and public pressure. If the United States decides that the only way to erase the humiliation is to strike harder, Iran will prepare to widen the pain. If Iran decides that America's visible signaling proves weakness, Iran may authorize another test. If both sides believe the other side is bluffing, the next move could be the one nobody can pull back from. And all of this sits on top of the economic layer. The Persian Gulf is not just a battlefield, it is an artery. Hormuz is not just water, it is global inflation, manufacturing costs, shipping insurance, fuel prices, food prices, and political stability in countries thousands of miles away. If this crisis affects energy flows, ordinary people who have never heard of the E-6B will feel it at the pump, in grocery bills, in interest rates, in job markets. That is why the story matters beyond military circles. A casualty claim can become a deterrence crisis. A deterrence crisis can become an oil shock. An oil shock can become political instability. Political instability can force governments into worse decisions, and worse decisions can keep the war alive. That is the chain. So where are we now? We are in the fog window. The fog window is the period after a shocking claim, but before credible public confirmation. It is the most dangerous moment because everyone is acting with partial knowledge. Iran is trying to maximize uncertainty. Washington is trying to preserve operational secrecy. Allies are trying to understand risk. Markets are trying to price fear. Publics are trying to decide whom to believe. The first side to create a durable narrative gains power. That is why America has to be careful. If it overstates, it loses credibility later. If it understates, leaks may destroy trust. If it hides too much, Iran's claim lives longer. If it releases too much, it may compromise operations. There is no easy answer, but there is one principle. In a crisis of credibility, precision matters more than volume. The United States does not need to shout. It needs to be believed. It needs to separate what is false, what is unknown, what is classified, and what will be disclosed later. It needs to avoid the kind of vague language that makes people think the truth is being managed rather than reported. Because that is exactly what Iran is betting on. Iran is betting that America's institutions are too slow, too political, and too cautious to kill the claim before the claim does damage. Maybe that bet is wrong. Maybe Washington will produce a clear account. Maybe the number will fall apart. Maybe the E-6B signal will succeed and both sides will step back. But if that does not happen, this crisis could become the start of something larger. Not because one number is magic, but because one number can force a chain of decisions. And in war, the chain of decisions is often more dangerous than the first shot. The lesson here is simple. Do not watch only the casualty claim. Watch the response. Watch the words the Pentagon uses. Watch whether America gives a number or avoids one. Watch whether the E-6B signal is followed by more deployments. Watch whether Iran repeats the claim or moves to a new threat. Watch Hormuz. Watch oil. Watch militias in Iraq and Syria. Watch the Red Sea. Because if this was only propaganda, it will fade. But if this was the opening move in a campaign to overload America's deterrence system, then it will not fade. It will repeat in another form. Another number, another base, another ship, another aircraft, another silence. That is how the pressure builds. Iran does not need to win the battlefield in one day. It only needs to prove that America cannot keep the battlefield contained. That is the real danger. And that is why the most important object in this story may not be the casualty number at all. It may be the aircraft America moved after the number appeared, because sometimes the answer tells you more than the accusation. And this answer told the world that Washington heard the message